The desert does not care who you are. I lived in the desert for a little while as a kid, and I learned that lesson the hard way a couple of times. But on May 30th of 1899, the desert stretched wide and empty across the Arizona territory as a stagecoach rolled through the dust and the heat toward Globe, Arizona. The wheels turned slow, cutting shallow tracks into hard ground that had seen more travelers than it could remember. The horses moved steady, not hurried, because there was no reason to hurry. Men and women sat inside the coach, believing that in routine and distance, believing that danger belonged to other roads and other times and other trips and other travelers. The West had a way of teaching people lessons. It still does. It rarely bothered to warn people first. There had been a time when stagecoach robberies were about as common as storms on the plains, but those days were passing. Railroads were pushing farther each year, and with them came a different kind of order. The coach running between Globe, Arizona and Florence had not been robbed in years. No one rode shotgun anymore, which was a rider who literally rode on the seat next to the driver with a loaded shotgun. But no guard was there watching the horizon with that loaded rifle. It was a quiet route. It was the kind that made a man lower his guard without realizing that he had. Out there, confidence could be as dangerous as a weapon. From behind a low rise, two riders came into view. They did not rush. They did not shout. They simply just appeared, slow, as if the land had chosen to reveal them at the exact moment that they needed it, at the moment it mattered the most. One of them sat straight in the saddle, dressed in men's clothing, hat low, revolver drawn with a steady hand. That rider was Pearl Hart, though the name meant little to anyone inside that coach at the time. Beside her rode a man known only as Joe Boot, a name that may or may not have been his own. Probably was not. Names were flexible in the Old West, and truth had a way of bending to fit the story. The coach slowed because it had no choice. Guns have a language that does not require any kind of translation. Boot covered the passengers while Pearl stepped forward, her voice calm, her instructions clear. There was no shouting, no wild movement, no chaos. She asked for money and she got it. $431.21 passed from hands to hand, along with 2 firearms. That's equivalent to about $16,000 today in a matter of minutes. This was a clean job, almost careful in its execution. Then came the part that would forever follow her into legend. She gave each passenger $1 back. Not enough to matter, but enough for it to be remembered. In a land where survival was often measured in inches and hard metal coins, she chose to leave them something behind. They rode out as they had come in, without a hurry, without any noise, disappearing into a desert that swallowed men whole when it chose to. And for a moment, it looked like they might get away with it. The driver unhitched the horse and turned back toward town, and the law began to move the way it does. But distance still meant something in those days. A rider could vanish if he knew the land well enough, and if he trusted his instincts, if he held just long enough to make the difference. But luck is a thin rope, and it frays faster than most people expect. Some say that Pearl and Boot lost their way, turning in circles through country that looked the same no matter which direction a person faced. Others say that exhaustion caught up with them first. What matters most is that on June 5th, a posse found them asleep beneath the open sky. It was not a gunfight that ended a run. It was fatigue. Boot gave himself up without any kind of a fight. Pearl, however, did not. She resisted because surrender was not a habit that she had ever learned in her life. They were taken in, and that should have been the end of it. The law had them. The evidence was clear. There were witnesses. There was stolen money and weapons to tie it all together. And in most cases, that would have been enough. The West would be harsh. People understood that there were certain lines that would occasionally be crossed, but if you crossed them, you would pay for them. That was the bargain. That was how things worked. But to understand why things did not follow that path, you have to look back before the desert, before the gun, before the ride. Pearl Hart had been born Earl Taylor in a place far removed from Arizona, in Lindsay, Ontario, Canada, to a family that valued faith and education and a steady life. She'd been sent to boarding school at 16, where she met a man named Hart, a man described in ways that did not speak well of his character. She followed him anyway. People often do. Marriage did not bring her stability in any sense of the word. It brought movement and conflict and a life that shifted from one uncertain place to another. There were children, a boy and a girl. They were sent to live with her mother in Ohio. There was a trip to the Chicago's World Fair in 1893, which, by the way, this was the same time that H.H. Holmes was very active in his serial killer tirade. Look that up if you get a chance. But this is where spectacle and possibility stood side by side. It was there that she saw Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. It was a performance that took danger and turned it into something that a crowd could applaud. Somewhere in that noise and color, a different idea of life started to take hold of Pearl. She left her husband more than once. She worked where she could as a cook, as a singer, and perhaps in ways that paid better but carried different kinds of costs. There were reports of cigars and liquor and morphine and habits that didn't come without consequences. By 1898, she found herself in Mammoth, Arizona, working in a mining town that wasn't going to last. When the mine closed, so did her prospects. Around that same time, she claimed she received word that her mother was gravely ill. The claim would become the center of everything that followed in her life. With money short and very few options, she and Boot, a friend of hers, tried their hand at an old mining claim. There was no gold there. The ground gave them nothing. So they turned to something else. The stagecoach was not just a target, it was an answer to a problem they probably could not solve in any other way. After their capture, the process moved forward as it always does. Charges were filed, a trial was set, and the courtroom in Florence filled with people who wanted to see the woman who had stopped the stagecoach and walked away from it. Reporters came from across the country. Stories began to take shape before the verdict had even been considered. The West did not see many female outlaws, and curiosity can be about as powerful as any force in shaping public opinion. And when the trial began, the facts were not in dispute. The robbery had happened. The money had been taken. The witnesses spoke clearly. There was no confusion about what had been done. The only question left was why. This is where everything changed. Pearl stood before the jury and she told them she had done it to help her dying mother. She spoke of desperation, of duty, of a daughter trying to reach home before it was too late. It was a simple story, but it carried some weight. People understood family. They understood fear of loss. They understood the pull of something that can't be ignored. So the jury listened. They looked at her and they watched her not just as an outlaw, but as a woman who had lived a life that had not followed a straight path. They heard the story and they believed it. Pearl's life had never been as easy as it looked on paper. When the verdict came back, it was not guilty. The judge did not hide his anger. He scolded the jury and made it clear that he believed they had failed in their duty. The law had been set aside not because the crime had been proven, but because of the story had taken hold of the people meant to judge it, and she had pulled at their heartstrings. In that moment, justice did not fall apart. It shifted just enough to let one person slip through. But it didn't last. Almost immediately, Pearl and Boot were rearrested, this time on charges related to tampering with the United States mail. The system had found another way to hold them instead. They were sent to Yuma Territorial Prison, where the desert heat pressed against stone walls and routine replaced movement. That's the photo of Pearl that I have chosen for today's episode cover. It is a startling contrast photo of her against a stark backdrop sitting on a cot that was in her jail cell. Joe Boot eventually escaped. He disappeared into the same wide land that had once held him. He was not ever seen again. Pearl remained. She was the only woman in a prison that was built for men, and that alone made her a figure of interest. The warden allowed her certain freedoms, like a larger cell, the ability to speak with reporters, and to pose for photographs, like the one that I'm using. She understood the attention, and she used it. She navigated that world as carefully as she had navigated the robbery, adjusting, adapting, making the most of what she had in front of her. In 1902, she was pardoned by the territorial governor, Alexander Brody. She left prison with a train ticket and a name that had already begun to take a life of its own ahead of her. After that, she moved through the world in quieter ways. There were performances where she reenacted the robbery. There were reports of her working with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which was her dream since the moment she first saw them. But there were also arrests and rumors and marriages, and finally fading into a life lived under different names. The desert kept its silence, and the stagecoach routes faded eventually. But the story remained. And what makes this tale endure is not the robbery itself. It's not the money taken or the guns drawn. It's the moment that the courtroom, when a jury chose to believe something that could not be proven, and in doing so, changed the outcome of a crime everyone had witnessed. In a land built on hard rules and harder consequences, one story proved so strong, it was enough to bend both. You see, there was never any written, verifiable proof that her mother was ever sick at all. So here's the question that lingers long after the dust settles. If you had been sitting on the jury, knowing what was proven and hearing what was claimed, would you have followed the facts or would you have followed the story? Tell me what you think in the comments, because this is one of those moments where the answer says so much about us, way more than it does about the history. And always, if you enjoy stories like this, make sure you follow the History Happens Facebook page. Like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. Hit that like button, hit that share button. Tell your friends about this one, because I think this is kind of a fun story. And make sure you follow the Facebook page for more every single day deep dives into history's most fascinating moments, and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Every subscriber helps. I love hearing from you guys. I want to know your opinions. And yes, this is a bonus episode just because I found way too many fun and interesting things about this day in history. I'll see you tomorrow.